he has a passion for games in ELT and digital games and game-based learning and adapting games to ELT. So today's session is about interactive storytelling games. And we hope you find that interesting. So let's give Graham a warm welcome.
Thank you for the introduction, Vicky. So let me share my screen and we can start. So hopefully you can all see the first screen now. So interactive storytelling games online is what I'll be talking about today. And I think they're a great way to motivate language learners to speak and listen in particular. And what I like about them is that they're easy to set up and can be easily adapted by the teacher to most levels and suitable to play with most age groups as well. So they're quite a flexible tool for a teacher to have in their toolkit, if you like. And during this workshop, we'll look at the best way to approach online interactive storytelling games. I'll show you a couple of examples and what I thought when I came to design them. And then hopefully we can finish by having a discussion about how you as teachers can design your own games for your own learners. So that's what I'll be doing. Now, before the webinar, I suggested that everyone do some pre-tasks. Could you just write yes in the chat if you actually did the pre-tasks? The first pre-task was a reflection activity. If you didn't do it, it doesn't matter. They're not necessary for this webinar, but the idea was to take something called SOFLA, which Lane Marshall has presented on in a previous IATEFL LTSIG webinar, which is Synchronous Online Flipped Learning Approach, and ask you to think about the subject of the webinar before the actual webinar and to have some experience of it. And the reason for doing that is normally when I do this type of webinar on interactive storytelling games, what I do is we play a game and then we talk about it afterwards, and I never get onto some of the other sort of more in-depth discussions about the design of the games, etc. So I thought this would be a bit different in that I would ask everybody to reflect on these questions, because the games are very much similar to something called role-playing games. And if you're unfamiliar with role-playing games, you might have heard of a game called Dungeons and Dragons, which is the most famous fantasy role-playing game. And interactive storytelling games takes elements from that type of game and adapts them for the language classroom. So the idea was for you to reflect upon your experience of games, and in particular role-playing games. Then the next task was to choose something to read. The selection was about using role-playing games in the classroom, in the English classroom, which Elena Perisiada wrote about, or having a look at a particular role-playing game, for example, Saving the Princess by James Egerton, or Hiking Adventure by Mike Pastori. And then the other example article was best practices if you want to learn from dungeon masters. Dungeon masters or game masters is the term for the person who facilitates a role-playing game, or in our case, an interactive storytelling game, which is usually the teacher, but not always. It doesn't have to be. As I said, it doesn't matter if you haven't read any of those, but you'll probably, your experience of this webinar will be enriched if you have. And if you're watching the recording, then what I recommend is you pause the recording and reflect upon these, and maybe have a look at a couple of those. The other thing I asked you to do, there was a lot that you could have done. The intention wasn't for you to watch all of these or read all of these, but just to have a flavor of what the game is like, because we're not going to play one today. and there were 3 recordings of playtests of 3 different games: A Fortnight Across the Valley, Get the Treasure and Escape the Island. Those 2 are games that I actually created, and then A Quiet Year, which is a commercially available game that we play tested with the RPG and ELT Facebook group some time ago, and that's a map making game. So those give you should have a flavor of what those types of games are. What I'm going to do next in the rest of this webinar is the following. We'll be looking at interactive storytelling generally, and then I'm going to look at 2 games in a bit more detail. They're very different types of games. One of them is called Escape the Family Dinner Party, and the other one is Get the Treasure and Escape the Island, which featured in one of the recordings that I suggested that you watch. And then we'll talk about the ideas behind designing your own game for your own classroom, for your own students, or adapting one. So that's what we'll be doing. So first of all, let me give you a bit of a background in interactive storytelling. What is an interactive story? Well, obviously, you could say interactive and story have their meaning, so you can work it out. But what I based this upon is something that was very specific, that a teacher many years ago, when I was a classroom teacher in Barcelona, I came across Mark White's ideas. He is or was a teacher in Japan, and he had this idea of scripting stories that were culturally appropriate for his language learners, putting them in pairs, giving one of them the story to read and the other acting as a listener. But rather than just listening to the story, at various points during the story, the storyteller would ask the listener questions, and usually there were additional information questions. So there were questions to make sure that the listener was paying attention, but also they wouldn't affect how the story actually developed. Some of them, when they did affect how the story developed, the storyteller could actually reject the answer or accept it, depending on whether the listener supplying the information could provide the right answer, or that would lead the story to the other way. So I thought this was quite interesting, and I tried it out, and it seemed to work very well with my students. What I liked about it, as I said before, is that you can adapt it to the level very easily. If you're the storyteller, you can adapt it very easily to the level of the student. It was quite an interesting way of producing texts that would involve reading, listening, and speaking in an interesting way, and locally and culturally relevant. So I gave it a go, and I came up with a story for my learners that I'm going to try out with you now, so you get a flavor of how this worked. And I have one volunteer from the committee. Raquel, I think you said you would be happy to participate, to act as the listener. Thank you very much. So what I'm going to do, Raquel, is I'm going to read you the story, and I'll be stopping at various points to ask you questions, and you just answer whatever you think, and I'll either accept or ask you to ask you the question again. Okay, so off we go. So this is a story called The Small Town Photographer. A photographer lives in a small town. What's his name, Raquel?
His name is Kurt.
Kurt, yes. Kurt, the photographer, lives in a small town. Where is the small town?
I think somewhere in the countryside of England.
Okay, where exactly in England?
Let's consider Leeds.
Leeds. Okay, in the countryside outside of Leeds.
Yeah.
Now, Kurt has made a successful living for many years as a photographer. And in the window of his shop, he proudly displays some of the wedding photographs he's taken of happy couples over the years. He's very fond of one photograph in particular. What does it show, Raquel?
Well, he's very fond of one photograph where he can see the outdoors, the couple, but also the outdoors background today.
Yes, you're right. Definitely. More particular, it shows a photograph of a couple who had just got married and they were posing next to a ruined tower with a brilliant red sunset in the background of the picture.
Beautiful.
And that's why he's proud of it. He thinks it's a particularly good photograph, but there's something else which is special about it. What's that, Raquel? What do you think that is?
He knows both the groom and the bride as they studied together when they were teenagers. So they have a friendship and it means a lot to him.
Well, no, not exactly, actually. He didn't know the bride and groom at all until they came into his shop. But it was a good guess. But no, it's more about the nature of the photograph. Something has happened ever since he has displayed the photograph in his shop window. What is that?
It has attracted more people to appreciate his work, and also people have contacted him for work because it shows the quality of his photographs and his creativity, I'd say.
Exactly, that's it. So ever since he started displaying the photo in his shop window, there's been a massive increase in the number of customers his photographic studios receive, especially for weddings. And the people who come to him to hire him as a photographer always mention the photograph, that particular photograph. So it's, if you like, it's his lucky photograph. And he's convinced that the photo is a one-off. He's often tried to recreate the photograph with different couples, taking them back to the same place just outside of Leeds. But Kurt has never been able to really capture that magic that he did in that one photograph. So, what is his explanation for that, Raquel? Why do you think that is?
I believe it's a combination of the moment, and it was so spontaneous. And now when he has to take the same photograph again, people kind of rehearse it, and there's a different feelings. The photos are still good, but it's for him as a photographer, as a professional photographer, there's this element of spontaneity missing somehow, but just a little bit.
Exactly. You're absolutely right. And that he was just starting out, he was very enthusiastic. He chose the place on a whim. It wasn't something that he thought particularly about until the moment. The time of the day was just right. The couple in question was so in love, plus that factor X, the X factor, some different unknown factor that adds to this. So years later, 1 October morning, what is he doing? What is Kurt doing?
He was browsing through his social media.
Not
Instagram.
really. He doesn't like Facebook or Twitter or so. Actually, he's quite old-fashioned. He doesn't really use social media. What was he doing in his shop?
Oh, I think he was reorganizing the pictures and trying to just move things around a little bit, cleaning, cleaning up.
Exactly. He was reorganizing his negatives because he's very old school and he takes photographs with film, and he was reorganizing all of those in his shop when he was surprised by a very special visitor. Who was it?
I believe it was somebody who had needed his services before he had taken the photograph of his wedding some years ago.
Yes, it was. It was a woman actually, and not only was it someone who was a previous customer, it was the woman in the very special photograph.
Oh,
She came into the shop, and he recognized her. He's looked at that photograph so much, he recognized her. Quite a bit
oh.
older, but still recognizable. She was waiting until he wasn't busy and introduced herself. What does she want?
I think she wanted a copy and a poster of this photograph because it brings her happy memories.
Well, actually, the opposite. The opposite is true. Now, she said that she'd recently moved back to the town after living elsewhere. Where was she living?
I think she was living in London. Now she's getting back to town.
She was living in London. She's moved back to Leeds.
Yeah.
And now she said she was living with her mother.
Oh,
Oh, what does Kurt think has happened?
I think maybe at this moment she's looking for a job, maybe to get started because she had recently got divorced and
Yeah,
it's over.
exactly. So she's moved back to Leeds because she didn't say she's divorced her husband, but Kurt just assumed it because she said she was moving back to Leeds and looking for the job and living with her mother. So she doesn't explain much, but she does ask Kurt, the photographer, for a big favor. What is it?
Maybe to remove that particular photograph from the window, like because it was being exposed and she had just been through a divorce. It's not the kind of memory she wants to look at.
Exactly. She was very surprised when she walked along the high street to see her photograph of that once happy day and now not a happy memory displayed so prominently in the photographer's studio. So she asks Kurt to remove the photograph from his window. Now Kurt is very surprised by the woman's request. Does he agree or not?
I think at first he tries to convince her it's no big deal, but I believe that as she explains her point, he agreed. Well, he tries to convince her not to, because he really appreciates the photograph from the professional point of view. But I believe that he agrees with that. In the end, he gives in.
You're absolutely right. It obviously respects the woman's wishes, and he decides to remove the photograph at the end of the day. Now, the next day, he immediately regrets his decision. Why? And at this point, I'm going to stop. You get the idea. This is the type of story. Thank you very much, Raquel, for being the guinea pig. This is the type of story you have. So you have a script, and the storyteller has questions to ask the listener as you go along. Now, typically, this type of activity you would do by giving one student, putting students in pair, giving one student the story, and having the other students in the pair answer the questions, etc., and be the listener. You could still do that, I think, online by putting students into breakout groups, or you could do, as we've done, an example with one volunteer, or you could do it and ask all of the students to come up with the answers if you want. Either way, I think this is how that story works. Now, that's interactive stories. What I'm going to move on to now is interactive storytelling games. So the idea behind interactive storytelling games is that it becomes a game. So rather than just a story, there's an objective, which is what makes it a game. But also you can play with groups rather than pairs or a full class. And also you have other things. It's less scripted. So role-playing games are less scripted. They are interactive. So I think the more that they are co-created and open-ended, the better. And you also need to add the element of random events and outcomes. So you can't push students towards a particular end. There has to be some sort of element of doubt whether they're going to actually achieve things, or and you have to sort of encourage their creativity during the story. The other thing, as I said, they're facilitated by Games Master, which is typically the teacher's role, but it doesn't have to be. You could have, if you've played a couple of these, you could suggest that one of the students do it. If you have the students playing in groups, which they could do, once they have an idea of what has to happen, then one of the students could take the role as the Games Master if you want. And these activities, I think, work well if they're quite short, for 20 minutes or so, 30 minutes, because you don't want to take up a whole class for them. But if you do design or have an activity or a game that is longer, then one of the things I think you could do is play part of it during several classes. So you keep a story going, maybe at the beginning of a class. I'm going to look at two of these games now. One of them is called Get the Treasure and Escape the Island, and the other one is Escape the Family Dinner Party, which is what I'm going to look at first. Now, this is a live listening interactive role-playing game designed to encourage speaking. Most of the games that I design, I'm interested in doing so to try and motivate students and encourage them to speak. This could be played in a classroom or online, and it requires no other materials other than this PowerPoint. But you don't even need that, actually. If you have the story, you could do it without the visuals. I think having the visuals might help, or it might not be necessary. I think the idea of this would be for B1, B2 students, and it would take about 20 to 30 minutes to play. Now, the idea is that you have a scenario, which I think many people will be able to understand. Sorry, I didn't mean to move on. Whereas you have a family, and it is the cousin David's birthday party, and you or the students play the part of nieces and nephews of the Uncle Baco and Aunt Camilla, who your mother is obliging you to go to the party and take a present, etc. There's quite a lot to this. The idea is that you need to go to the party, not upset anyone, be polite, and then something comes up which tells you that there's something that you would like to do, and this is where you get the students to say what has happened, whether it's an event or something. That means you have to leave the party early, and these parties normally last quite a long time, because cousin David likes to play board games after dinner. So your objective is to go to the party, not upset everyone. Your parents or your mother gives you certain things that you need to tell certain members of the family, which I won't go into the details, but they're kind of, you have to introduce them naturally into the conversation and then get out before the end. So that's the objective. And the idea of this is that this is a very kind of typical situation. It's also targeting language. So the idea is that the students would have to use small talk to socialize with family members, and then to apologize and make excuses about why they have to leave earlier. Now, if you have a small group, then it's very easy. Each one of the students would take the role of a particular cousin, for example. If you have a large group of students, then what I would suggest is that you split them into groups, and each group would take the role of a cousin. And I think no more than five cousins would be appropriate. If you do that, then at some point you would need to split them up into breakout rooms and have them discuss certain questions. For example, what birthday present they want to buy their cousin, etc. You can give language to help the students before the game, and pre-teach it or make sure that they understand it, etc. And then when you go on, you basically give them a briefing from the mother about particular things that the grandpa needs to be told, the grandmother, cousin David, Uncle Bacco, and Aunt Camilla, for example. To give you an example, the suggestion is that Aunt Camilla needs help in the kitchen, or it could be Uncle Bacco, and then the other one tells jokes, for example, and they're very bad jokes, but you need to humor the uncle, for example, if he tells a bad joke. Cousin David has just started university. He likes board games. That will give you an idea of what kind of present to buy him. Grandma Mary is slightly hard of hearing, so you need to be able to repeat some of the things. And then Grandpa Philip has a tendency to make things up. So you need to sort of cut him off before he starts telling outrageous or ridiculous stories. So those are the sort of scenarios. And then what happens is, after you get the students to remind you what they have to do, you move on, being greeted by Aunt Camilla, and they start interacting with Aunt Camilla. They move on to Uncle Bacco, then Grandma Mary and Grandpa Philip, and then the cousin David. Cousin David, there's a little twist in that although he started university, he's decided to drop out. So if you've bought him a present which relates to the university course that he started, then that's another sort of, you have to commiserate and apologize with him for buying that. You could offer to take the present back and get a refund, etc. If you've bought him a board game, then the board game that you've bought him, he'll say that he already has, and that will also initiate the need to apologize, etc. You need to, the dinner starts and already the clock is on. The small talk is used then, and then towards the end of the dinner, that's when the students will need to start coming up with their excuses. And if their excuses are coherent and seem to be valid, then they'll be accepted without being questioned. If the excuses, as sometimes they are when students do this, are a bit ridiculous, then they'll be questioned and challenged, and the students will have to react to that. That's the nature of the game. It's quite a flexible game with the idea of particular language points, and they need to leave in time. I'm going to go on now to the second game, which is very different. I've deliberately chosen two different types of games to present to you today. The first one is a setting which would be normal for students, presumably, to experience, going to a birthday party, a family birthday party. And I think it's safe to say that at some points we would rather not be at those events. And so if we can find a way of making an excuse about upsetting people and leaving early, then that's something that I think we can all say that we've done before or might have to do. This other game is very sort of, it's more of a fantasy setting, the idea of a group of people coming together and they've found a treasure map. And this again is for 3 to 5 characters. So with large classes, you would put them into groups to play a different character. This is very much, the other game was very much, the students could play themselves. They didn't have to invent a personality. This is very different. The idea is that it's more of a role-playing game, as in that you take on the role of another person. It's left up to the students what kind of role they want to say. So you can imagine there are 5 people who didn't particularly know each other very well beforehand, but they've come together. Why? Because one of them has a map. The other one has heard a story about where the treasure is hidden on an island. One person has a boat, for example. And there may be other reasons. I can't remember exactly. I think there could be reasons that the students come up with or whatever. So students come up with their characters. They have a minimum amount of information that they need to come up with: a name, a profession. All of the other background, it's up to you and the students whether you think you would want them to work on a backstory which is more convincing. You could have them role play their first meeting when they come together and say what they want. And this is also a game that requires you to use some props. So apart from the story which is on the PowerPoint, which I'll be sharing with you later, you need to have a way of randomly deciding whether something is right. You can't see what I'm holding up. It's one of these, but green. But because of the green screen in Zoom, it's not sure. But one of them is green, one of them is red. It could be a yes or no. You put them in a bag and you draw randomly to come up with the successful or unsuccessful solutions. So that's a random element. The other thing that the students have to do in this game, there's the backstory. There is a map, but it doesn't have to be that map. It could be anything. I've found that having a map actually makes things more concrete for the students. It can be useful. But the other thing they have to do when they decide on their backstory is they have to decide what they secretly want. And this is something that the students would do if they're playing if they're playing individually, then they decide individually. That's no problem. If you're playing with a big group of students and they're working in groups, then you want to put them in breakout rooms so they can decide what they secretly want. And that's their hidden want is something they can reveal during the game at any point or at the end of the game. Now, what would that mean, that secret want? Well, the idea is that the secret is something that they want to accomplish when they go to the island that is not related to, or could be related to, the actual finding of the treasure. It could be that their plan is to steal the treasure from their friends, or it could be that the plan is actually what the secret identity is a special agent who knows that this mission is illegal and wants to arrest the others, or it could be that one of the characters is a journalist and really isn't interested in the treasure, but more about writing a book and hopes to publish a bestseller. Now, those secret wants, once they're revealed, you pull out a token to see whether it's successful or not, in this case, the red one. Now, obviously, if the students, as they go along, they reveal the secret want immediately, then you decide whether it's successful or not as you go along. If you don't get to that point, there are a number of other challenges, and these again are decided by the students. So the students actually decide together what 3 things are going to be make the adventure difficult. And it could be, well, it's been raining, so the ground is very difficult to walk over. It could be that there are mountains to climb up. It could be that the boat runs out of fuel as soon as you arrive, or you have no water, there's no fresh water. And you come up with those, their general difficulties, and then each of the students or groups of students also decides to write a challenge. And randomly, the teacher or the game master chooses one of the challenges to be revealed and overcome as you go on. So it could be, for example, you arrive in the island and there's a massive thunderstorm, and the students then have to say what they would do to overcome the challenge. And there are 5 turns and 5 challenges. And the other thing is that the students also have 2 chances, or rather 10 chances for all of the 5 challenges. They can try different things. So for example, if it's a thunderstorm and the island is impossible to walk upon, they could say, we wait a day. If it's red, then that's unsuccessful. After a day, the rain continues and they have to come up with something. Well, they decide to improvise and create something to keep themselves dry and find a way across to the treasure. Okay, it's green. That means it's successful and you move on. They've used 2 challenges, 10 in total. If they run out of challenges, the game is over. If they haven't reached the treasure, that means they've been unsuccessful. What they might have been successful with is their wants. So what you do is, as you go through, you do the challenges, the students reveal their secret wants as and when they want. And if they haven't revealed their secret wants, what happens in challenge 5, if they've still got chances left, they come to the treasure and we see them get the treasure. At this point, then everyone needs to reveal their secret wants and hidden challenges, and you pull out the card and see whether this has been successful or not. When I've played it, the last time I played it, one person was a biologist, I think. He was looking for a particular bird that can only be found on the island, and really wasn't interested so much in the treasure because the bird was worth more than the treasure, and they were successful in finding the bird. There's an example of a creative hidden want that someone had. And I think this is the idea behind that type of game. Right, so those are the 2 example games, and I'm going to go through now what I suggest you can do if you wanted to adapt one or write one of these, design one of these games for yourself. And then I'll open up the floor to questions, which I hope there'll be some at least. We shall see. So my suggestion is you always start with the learning objectives whenever you design this type of game. So the idea of the game is not to design a game that is fun, but to design a game that will result in language practice. Of course, I think a lot of the criticism that teachers get when they play games is that, well, it's not necessary to play games to learn a language, but the idea of fun, I think, and playing a game with students can make learning the language or practicing language more memorable. And that for me is why I've always been attracted to games. As long as you keep in mind your learning objectives, so if the idea is to practice small talk or making excuses, that's one thing. To just have students practice their speaking in general, well, make sure you're monitoring them, you're looking for their errors, etc., and you deal with that afterwards. Whatever it is, I think the idea should always be what learning objectives you want to have for the game. Then my thought is always, what kind of story does that lead to? So build a story around the learning objectives. And then with online interactive storytelling games, as I said before, I think it's important to have some kind of co-creation in the story. Don't make the story so rigid that the students can't bring their own ideas and creativity to it. I think you really be surprised with students. I think with this kind of structure, students can come up with some very interesting things. Keeping the story open-ended helps as well, because then you can change it. It doesn't have to end in one particular way as things go on. I think that's the skill of the games master. So you as the teacher, if you're facilitating, you need to be able to be open to ideas and really encourage through the language for the story to develop in the way that it does organically. Adding some type of randomness, be it through this sort of simple system or other systems involving dice, which are very typical in role-playing games, I think is worthwhile. That means it's not just you, the teacher, who's deciding whether something happens or not. It's actually left to chance. I think that's important, to have that kind of random events and outcomes that you're presenting with them. I think that is important in a game. The idea of of a game that is not just, you know, just walking through the steps of something that you know where it will end up. And then that player agency, not predetermined. Bringing ideas from the students is really good. Facilitating is important. I think it's just something that you get used to doing. I think all teachers should be able to find that quite easy. And again, I think it's important that the game isn't too long, that it doesn't take up too much time. You can play the game and then deal with other aspects of language or spread over several classes, as I said. If anyone is interested in doing more of this or playing some of these games, then what I'd like to do is recommend that you join a group called RPG in ELT, Role-Playing Games in ELT, which is on Facebook. And that group, since I found it, I've been sort of inspired. In fact, these two games, some of the games that I wrote, I was inspired through thinking, oh, this is a really interesting area to explore. And we meet and play test once a week, or we could play test more frequently if there was a demand for it. And I think those have been not only really interesting ways of getting feedback on particular games, and people volunteer to bring games to that session. At the moment, we meet on Thursdays in the evening in Europe, lunchtime, my time in the Americas. And it's been a way of meeting other teachers who are interested in this type of activity and sharing ideas, playing a game together or part of the game together, and getting feedback on how it went or how it could be improved, etc., has been invaluable. And you've seen, I think, one of the, if you've done the pre-work, you've seen one of the playtest recordings and that. So I recommend that anyone who's interested in exploring this further, that's a good place to do so. And that brings me to the end of what I have to say. So I'm going to hand it over to questions. I don't know, Vicky, Raquel, if there've been many questions so far.
No, there have been lots of comments, but no questions. So if people have questions, please post them in the chat, and we'll try to get Graham to answer them. And I can get started with my first question, can I?
Sure. Let me just say first, Vicky, that the link there on SlideShare is where it's not there now, but this presentation I'll upload there, so people can access that later if they're interested. And the games that I've shared in the presentation are the instructions of how to play them. So you've got 2 ready-made games for you if you wanted to do it.
Okay then. So I'm going to play a little devil's advocate here.
Sure.
And the game you played was aimed at B1, B2 students. My question is, what happens with lower level students, and can we make this work for A1, A2?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's one that I've been thinking about a lot recently, actually, because a lot of the interest that I've had when I've talked about this with teachers has been about, yeah, but you really need quite a high level to be able to play these games. And the 2 games I presented today, I think that is the case. So it's a challenge to design this type of game for lower levels, definitely. I've been thinking, I recently, I've written a game for beginners, but it's not so much a storytelling game, it's more of an escape room game, with using simple there is, there are, and directions, etc. And that's something that I think you can do. But interactive storytelling games, I think the idea of having a simple story with questions, that's easy to do. So the photographer activity, you can use any text from your book,
yeah,
for example, and just insert questions and have that's the easiest way to do it, or take another simple text and do that. But actually turning it into a game, I'd love to hear from anyone who thinks they could do that.
Michael,
there is a game, I think the one that I shared in the pre-reading, James Egerton, which was
yeah, Michael Burge is saying that Princess in the Tower could be quite suitable for lower levels. Michael, would you like to, we can open the microphone if you'd like to elaborate on that.
Well, I haven't actually played the game. I've seen James demo it, but it's essentially built around learning prepositions. So that the idea is to reach the princess. In order to reach the princess, you have to cross the river. So you go over the river and under the, what do you go under? Under the bridge. Surely should be over the bridge, across, along the road, etc. So I think he really conceived it for A2, probably.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, you're right. That is a good example, I think, of a lower level RPG. See, there's a question from Laura Matt Williams about choose your own adventure books, and yeah, I think that's another great thing. But I think it's great for that's a good idea actually, because the responses that students would have to come up with can be quite, they don't have to be complicated, you know. Open the door, I open the door, I walk through I walk along the corridor, etc. And that either could be done as a reading, as you're suggesting, or as a listening. So the kind of interactive story, but turn it into a game with several different options. I walk through the door on the left, or walk through the door on the right, and then the reader then goes to that particular room, whatever. Yeah, that's a bit like the game I was saying I just sort of started designing, which is a simple maze game, but without much of a story in it. But I think adding a story to it is a good idea.
Well, you know, Marcos Benavides wrote a whole series of choose your own adventure kind readers, I think. So
that's right.
It might be a good idea to turn those into an interactive game.
That's right. Well, you could actually use
those are probably already targeted to certain levels, so it would be easy to.
Yeah, it would be very easy to take those texts and just use them in, you know, in that way.
I'm going to hunt for, I think I have one of them. I'm going to hunt for it and see what I can do.
I have one as well, but I can't remember. It's been so long since I looked at it.
Laura, give me a second. I'll just Google it because I don't remember, but I'll get back with the answer in a second.
Just scrolling through some of the comments.
Yeah, it's Atama Books. I'm going to post the link so you can go in and have a look.
Any more questions from anyone?
Okay.
Or any more comments? Would anybody like to?
Okay, that's the link. Laura, you were saying you did one as a whole class. Okay, would you like to tell us about it and the kind of activities you built around it?
Sure. So we used one with teenagers as we had a week-long course, and the theme was the media. and I found a graded reader choose your own adventure called Feeling the Heat at Radio Flame. It's with Richmond readers. It's, you know, they're not particularly well known, but they have a short series of these choose your own adventure books. And it's actually aimed at business students, but it worked quite well with the teenagers because they basically took the role of a manager at a radio station that was failing, and they had to get the radio station to be hip and trendy again, and they had to make decisions about, you know, who they would hire for a concert, and would they fire a DJ and not, and things like that. So because they were a class, they had to make the group decisions. So it worked really well because, you know, you'd read a chapter, and then they'd have to go away and discuss it to get a communal decision. So it was really great for that kind of negotiation language and compromise and turn taking and all of those skills. And then throughout the week, there were also sort of where you do some language lessons in the morning, and then they'd use the graded reader in the afternoon and so on. So, you know, it actually sort of spread out across the 5 days and was a really, really interesting take on the course, I think, rather than using a sort of normal graded reader, which is much less interactive.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
Really, really interesting.
Absolutely. So we could start collecting all these ideas, I think, because they're really, really good. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would
Do
be
we
great.
have any more questions? We still have 5 minutes left. So if you want to take advantage of Graham's expertise here, please go ahead.
Or please come and share something that you've done.
Yeah.
Laura did. That would be really
in the
interesting.
meantime, how long does it take in average to adapt a game to be used in the classroom? Can you give us an example?
How long is a piece of string, Vicky? I think
I know. It depends on into how much detail you want to go. Sure.
Yeah, I think you can. It really depends on the complexity of the game. So, for example, the games that I've done have usually been inspired by things that have already existed. So the Get the Treasure and Escape the Island, for example, was based on a game that I played that is for native speakers or for anyone basically. It's not for language learning. And commercially available, but it was a lot more complex. There are lots of very interesting games out there, in particular lots of independently produced games that are either free or very cheap. And a site I recommend is, I'll have to remember it, but I think a Drive-Through RPG, I think is the name of the site. Maybe someone can Google that and put it in the chat as I'm speaking. Drive-Through RPG. And you can find lots of free games or independently produced games that give you lots of ideas. So there are a couple, and I think they were shared with in the RPG and the LT group, that I thought, wow, this is really interesting. I played them and thought, you can't play those just as they are, but you could adapt some of the game systems, so the game dynamics. So the idea of having challenges to overcome, and that being randomly decided was from that game. And that just sort of made me think about, well, how could I simplify it, etc. One of the games that was recorded we played in the RPG and the LT group that we made a recording of that is in the Pretasks. It's something called the Quiet Year, and that again is a game that it's a co-created map making game where you get a group of players together and randomly decide some things that happen, but each of the players decide where you are. You decide where you are. One person says, right, we're in a valley. There's a stream with fish in it, so you got fresh water. It's sort of like imagining a post-apocalyptic situation where there's a group of people trying to survive for a year, and each week of the year in that game, you pull out a playing card, and it represents something that happens, and you have to deal with it, and it's either something positive or negative, and you co-create the story as you go along. And we played that, and that was quite interesting. What I really liked about it was the map that we created. So we ended up with a very visual, but something that we created. I've not played that with students, just with a group of teachers. Michael was one of the teachers there, but I thought it was a lot of fun. But again, that was too complicated for language teachers. So I think the idea of stripping that down and making it into a simple game is what you need for language learning. Quite often, the games that are produced are meant to keep you stimulated without having to worry about language, because nobody on commercially available games that are not educational, they're not thinking about the difficulty of the language, either in the instructions or the game cards, etc. Whereas as teachers, we have to simplify things, because also the cognitive load of the language is enough of a challenge without the challenge of the game as well. So it has to be something fun, but actually stimulating enough to produce language.
I think that what is essential, or what comes through from your experience, is that when you have experience playing games in general, that can be transferred to certain game techniques or strategies that you can use to build your or adapt games for ELT.
Definitely. I think the important thing there is there's several traps. I think one of them is you can't just take a commercially produced game and use it in the classroom. Usually they need some kind of adaptation of the language or the instructions, or just of the time. You're not going to spend the time it would take to play one of the games really with your class. It's not a good use of time. You can just shorten it, simplify it. But also the other extreme would be you try and take a test you do and turn it into a game. That kind of gamification, just adding points to things, I think isn't really very stimulating or motivating for students.
Yeah, well, I'm not really into gamification, really, more into using games.
Yeah, I mean, I think
into game-based learning. Yeah,
I think it's a shame that the word gamification has been tarnished now, because most of the gamification that I've seen has been just sort of
adding points
and star charts and stuff.
To language tasks.
Whereas I think behind it, if you do read more widely on gamification, there's a lot of taking aspects of what work in games, which is not just, it can be stories, it could be choice, it could be agency, it could be a combination of some of the points, but it can't just be that. Leaderboards, all sorts of other motivational stuff, and adding it where it makes sense. That's quite interesting. It's something I've always thought I'd like to explore, but you're limited the amount of time that you have.
Well, everybody, time's up, and we've had a wonderful session, tried a few games, heard about how to make them work and where the ideas come from. And I'd like to thank Graham for all the work he put into this workshop. And thanks everybody for coming and joining us on our new series for LTSIG webinars on monthly on Saturdays. So our next webinar will be on August 29th, to be confirmed soon, speaker, topic, etc. So again, thanks everybody. See you soon.
Thank you, Vicky. Thank you, Phil. Thanks, Raquel. Thank you, everybody in the committee, and to all of you for coming along. It's been a pleasure. Hope you've found it interesting.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
thanks.
comments were great. Everybody was really excited.